thanks indeed for coming out this morning. It's heroic to get out of your beds at this hour in such a chill morning and with such beautiful sunlight, of course, and everywhere as well. But you're very, very welcome here. We're delighted you're able to come, and we're also very delighted we have a series of speakers of great eminence who are here to tell us about their thoughts with respect to the emotional bond. I thought initially, though, it would be useful to provide a bit of an introduction to what we're all about, what we're doing today specifically, what we're doing more broadly during the course of this year, and insofar as we've had anticipatory events in the spring semester. This is, of course, our great benefactor who appears here. Before he destroyed our economy during the Depression, he managed also to acquire a substantial fortune and eventually put it to good use through the Andrew Mellon Foundation. The Andrew Mellon Foundation is, of course, as you know, a great source of support to American academics and indeed to academic scholarship anywhere in the world. In particular, they chose to fund, in honoring one of the more important presidents, John Sawyer, something that they entitled the Seminar on the Comparative Study of Cultures. And these were rather difficult to secure. John Bedell, Sue Alcock, and I, who are the co-conveners, put a great deal of effort into this. And as a result, we've become quite, in some ways, flush with support this year. And we hope to pepper this year with all sorts of interesting events, including this one. What is the purpose of these Sawyer seminars that are helping to host this event? They have two roles in particular, two particular objectives. The first is that they are intended to examine the historical and cultural sources of contemporary developments. Now, the emphasis here is definitely on sources rather than on the contemporary, but nonetheless, we are also hoping very much, and we have partly effected, we think, this year, the idea of creating a temporary study center. That is, nothing that's going to be permanently ensconced at Brown or indeed at any other university, but one that is focused on a particular theme. And it's for this purpose that we've been brought together today. The program that is sponsoring this, we call affectionately PEC. Peck on the cheek, perhaps, but also the Program and Early Cultures. It was created back in the 70s and was attended for many years under the wise and prudent leadership of Kurt Raaflaub, under whose supervision it tended to focus on what was called the ancient world, which notoriously in many conceptions does not include the ancient, very ancient part of the world that I happen to work in, which is the pre-Columbian world. As a result, we decided to amend that title, and under now the co-direction of Professors Bedell and Alcock and me, we are now working in the Program in Early Cultures. It is intended to do the following. It is intended to foster collaboration, but particularly with the end to studying comparative civilizations, and to foster this in particular among our students, both at the graduate and undergraduate level. How could I not begin a lecture, though, with one of my favorite little critters of all, and that is the Pomeranian. We have had several, and here is a cheeky fellow, in fact, perched on Queen Victoria's table, as painted towards the end of one of her court painters' lives. In this case, it's Charles Barber. Marco on the Queen's breakfast table. I imagine nothing but a pet would be able to do this. No courtier would be able to keep their head if they chose to do this. Now, what we are looking at, though, and I'm just simply using that image as a framing device, are what I will describe as cynosures or cynosures. They're focal points of attention. They're nodes of attention that are going to be informing our discussion today and during the course of the next few months. We have devised, if you will forgive us, a neologism, consocial, in order to describe perhaps our principal target. And this is to focus on or target a notion of many creatures living together, in which we have not only a human conception of society, but one that would be superhuman, that would encompass and envelop and enfold other kinds of beings as well. In this respect, it might be described as an extended society, but also one that involves what we also have chosen to label an emotional ecology. And what we mean by that is, if we unpack these two terms, is let's focus first on the emotional. By the emotional, we simply mean a kind of tissue of sentiment, you might say, of meaning, and above all, of an engaged and impassioned commitment between these beings who happen to live together. If we focus on the second part of this expression, to an ecology. This is quite simply something that can be parsed as involving organisms of varying sorts, variously defined, variously labeled, identified, who are in a process of sustained interaction. This seminar has, and this is part of our proposal to the Mellon Foundation, is also based or predicated on a series of questions. The questions range from ones having to do with what is precisely in nomenclatural, or you might say ontological or existential terms, the ending and the beginning of the human. This is a very important question here. If, according to some scholars of Indo-European, in fact, the very word for man or human comes ultimately to the notion of someone who does or makes, an artificer. There are other kinds of etymologies as well, but we want to examine who are the agents here? How would they be constituted? How would they be explained? Are they animal? Are they human? Are they neither? Are they both? Or are they a combination of the two? In addition to that, we also wish to focus and to attend very carefully to the idea of what the meaning of these connections might be, what the moral duties might be that happen to affect these sorts of relations and understandings, and ultimately, how do they serve to constitute a social order, a new and perhaps different kind of social order, one that we live in, but that somehow has not levitated to the surface in ways that can be readily discerned. We also examining over time, and this has been a subject of some research by people in this room, about how these notions are acquired. What is their process? Are there patterns of acquisition? How are those ideas transformed over the time? How might they be even depleted or exhausted or abrogated? And ultimately, though, we are coming to a question, I think, ultimately here, finally, at the end of all things, the notion of reciprocities between these different kinds of beings. Not only of a status of existence by which they coexist, but in fact, how they play off one against one another, what sort of interactions might have, how one is simply transformed by the presence of the other. Now here we do take ourselves into the branches of comparative anthropology, which some of us have found some sources of inspiration in over the years. And one scholar among many that we cite in our proposal would be, of course, Philippe Descola of the Collège de France, who has spent many, many years working in Ecuador, among other places, in the Amazonian basin, as is one of our speakers today. But he is crucially concerned with this idea of reciprocities, of identity, and of transformation, of who is what and what is what. He might even be someone who could be described as being subject to an interest, above all, in typological dispositions, of a way of understanding and categorizing different kinds of societies. And this is a kind of background concept that might be of useful to us here today, insofar as we react to it, insofar as we accept it, insofar as we might reject it. Now, to Descola, you might have different kinds of societies. They might divide into different sorts of types. There could be ones that are predicated on moral continuities between animals and humans. Then, as we proceed through this kind of typology of Descola and others, there might be discontinuities or analogies that reflect back on humans, in which we don't see those same kinds of essential co-identities. We might also have a pattern, an animic or animistic pattern, in which some of these beings are connected literally by means of their lives and through their souls. And then ultimately there might be a view which is held to obtain today by Descola and others of a categorical distinction or separation between what is human and inhuman and so forth. Or it might choose to toss this particular typological pattern and suggest perhaps that these are always perhaps contingent in many animal relations, and that it's almost impossible to categorize all societies into a single categorical manner in this way. These are some of the many, you might say, a large suite of ideas that we could discuss today and which will be discussed during the course of this year. Our subject, however, is mostly going to look at the idea of an emotional bond today as part of our seminar, Animal Magnetism, a coinage, I believe, of Professor Alcock. Who else? Having to do here with, of course, the subject of today's talks. Now, we are going to be looking at a series of disparate presentations. They have a lot of rich information, a lot of rich empirical support. However, there are, you might say, a degree of tethers of continuity between them. One of which would be what might be the nature of souls. We can perhaps reflect back on some of the questions I posed before. We might be looking, for instance, at ideas of communion between different categories of being. We might be looking even at an unfolding within a broader set of societies, notions of societies, and then ultimately we might also be interested in how the human and the animal tend to coexist in their own person through practices of anthropomorphization. We are, above all, peck, again, not the one on the cheek, but the program in early cultures. And what this means is that we have, you might say, not a presentist focus, which is very much a concern in much of, even in archaeology today, but we are pastists. That is, we are interested in temporalities. We're interested in deep time, how these concepts might have developed not as fixed dispositions or as types, but how they might be conditioned by history and by circumstance and by process and by people and what they think and what they feel. And so we might begin here, for instance, with this endearing image, perhaps a little maudlin or sentimental, of Queen Victoria's Pomeranian. But as we dig back in time, as we go back by time's arrow, as shown here by the red, we might get to other images, other ideas of how humans coexist with humans, as in Circe, shown here in a late medieval woodblock, surrounded by her various animals who are magically transformed into servants, and indeed companions. Or we might even get back to the Maya, a subject that I hold near and dear, in which we could look at a rabbit that happens to have a cloth, textiles wrapped around his waist. He is holding and is nearby actually his favorite enema syringe. There's a long story there, which I will not trouble with you at this very early point in the morning. There are other kinds of animal conceptions among the Mayas. We look at these very, very pastist peoples. We can look, for instance, at notions of dynastic souls that would embrace a jaguar here entrapped within a cage. Or even of impersonations in which there's a comprehensive fusion between animal and humans, as in this gigantic toad being who happens to have within his X-ray mask, you can see the prominent face of a Maya king. Now, regrettably, we aren't going to fulfill all of that today because one of our speakers, Carl Taube, was very suddenly in a position of having to cancel out. He would have definitely augmented our pastism today, but nonetheless, there will be much discussion and there will be moderation by three of us who are very much living for most of our existence in entirely different millennia. So Carl will not be with us today, but we do hope to have him back. Rather, we will have these four very distinguished people. We will have Sue Curry first, and then I can attest that Erica does not have an enormous head. These are not to scale. You can see for yourself in a few minutes. And then nor is Kari particularly tiny and elfin, although she is a slim being. And then this, as you see, is Eduardo Cohen in the standard summer gear that all professors at McGill wear in that northern climate. So I welcome you today. We're very delighted to begin this series on what are very important questions. People have been thinking about them for a decade or more, but there's no denying that this is a theme that will not wither and die. It will not expire. It will continue to inform all of our research as we explore the emotional bonds between humans and animals. Now, with that introduction, I would like to do yet another. And this is, of course, to introduce our very first speaker, our very own Sue Curry. And I shall activate her program right now. And Sue, who is now serving as a postdoctoral fellow in our Mellon Sawyer program, again, generously supported by Andrew Mellon and his benefaction to that foundation, has come to us after a search of many, many, many recent PhDs. She is working on these very tangled, very vexed symbolic relations that happen to obtain between humans and animals. She was by far, of that large sample of applicants, the best person for this position. We're very delighted that she is here. Sue did her first degree in German at Grinnell College out in Iowa, but she has now migrated to warmer lands, although not here at Brown, but certainly intellectually, to those in the Mediterranean. She did her doctoral work at Indiana University in classical studies, and she also, of course, as many of us know here in Brown, conducted a very prestigious detour through the American Academy in Rome. Her thesis was entitled Human Identities and Animal Others, has also migrated in part into an article about animalizing the emperor, and I believe that she'll be touching on some of these subjects today. Other works of insight and I think stimulating sleuthing about human animals and animal humans are sure to come, we all hope and trust, during her fellowship year here at Brown. Animal Acts, I should also say, is her current course offering here at Brown, And in it, she explores, you might say, the problematic boundaries, the kind of diffused identities that might exist, and that certainly are pertinent or germane to our topic today. I have heard that the undergraduates love this class, and we, as I speak on behalf of Sue and John, are delighted in PEC, the Program in Early Cultures, that she can speak to us today about that very maligned denizen of a once burning Rome. Her paper is entitled, Nero Was a Pussycat, Animalizing Humans in Ancient Rome.
Thanks, Steve, very much for that introduction. Thank you all for being here. It is said that if you suffer from performance anxiety or a fear of public speaking, you should imagine the members of your audience naked to diffuse the terror of the situation. But fear not, my little monkeys. To buck myself up, I prefer to imagine you all as various kinds of non-human animal, who together form a colorful menagerie of species loved and feared, disdained and revered. So for the sake of my own psychological survival, I will be actively rhetorically animalizing you during the course of this lecture. Please don't mind me. What I intend to do during this half hour is to use an episode from the private life of the notorious Emperor Nero, who lived in the 1st century CE, to examine two issues in the interpretation of human-animal relationships in imperial Rome. The first issue is that of the difference between the emotional bond Romans felt for a particular species of animal versus the Roman relationship with the concept of the animal. The second issue is that of self-identifying to various degrees with a particular species of non-human animal, which engages the issue of the emotional bond, versus having a specific or generic identity of animal thrust upon you by others. And we'll move from the larger world of nature and the Roman arena into the world of a particular ancient text, the biographer Suetonius's Lives of the Caesars, in which the notorious Emperor Nero is described as intentionally acting like an animal and later animalized by the author, back into this world at large today. So, brave lions, fasten your seatbelts. All right, so let us begin by looking at the leopard. And behind the leopard, we should see the shadow of wild felines generally, but especially the cheetah, as in Roman art it is often difficult to differentiate between the leopard and the cheetah. But following Jocelyn Toynbee, we'll use the word leopard to refer to both leopards and cheetahs. The only chance most ancient Romans, and certainly the inhabitants of the city of Rome itself, would have had to view a leopard, as well as other types of wild feline, would have been during the beast hunting events that took place in arenas and amphitheaters, in the Roman Forum and Circus Maximus in Rome itself, before the building of the Colosseum. During both the Republic and imperial periods of Rome's history, leopards and cheetahs were trapped in Asia or Africa, rather ingeniously, actually, using a baited traveling box or sometimes a mirror inside a box. The leopard then sees its reflection in the mirror, mistakes it for an enemy, pushes the mirror, which would give way, and the animal would be trapped in the box. It's sort of brilliant. The leopard would then be transported, displayed, hunted, killed. Surviving mosaics often depict leopards, even as they are being killed, in incredible detail, their faces expressive perhaps of their traumatic experience, as in this panel from Torre Nuova and now in the Borghese Gallery. And the Romans go in for a lot of blood in their mosaics as well. And sometimes the leopards are even named, as in this scene from Leptis Magna. It's very difficult to make out, but under that image on the top right, it says Rapidus, so like swift one. We also have names Fulgentius, so shining or splendid one, and we don't know what the hell Gabatius really means. So it's a mystery. Now, I get super excited, very excited, when animals are named in ancient art. I get very romantic about it, as it suggests to me the individuation of a species, the notion that perhaps a bond may develop between humans and individual members of even a wild and dangerous species, in a way that it does not develop between humans and a particular species en masse. Even in the context of the ancient arena, But this mosaic is from a room of a bath complex thought to belong to a business group, a collegium, of professional hunters, or those in the wild animal export business. So the relationship may be one of commerce and commodification rather than affection. Or perhaps it's both. We can't really know that. Ancient Romans may also have seen leopards play the role of executioner in public ad bestias executions, such as the one depicted on this mosaic from Zlatan in what is now the country of Libya. We'll return to this image in a little bit, but please take note of the man bound and tied and being attacked by some sort of wild animal, a leopard. Panther is usually used in the ancient sources. Culturally, the leopard has a long association with the god Dionysus or Bacchus in Roman tradition and does not get the kind of play in metaphors and similes that the lion and lioness do. This is true of visual similes as well. Little ducklings, such as the lion hunt scene depicted on the lid of the Grotta Rossa mummy sarcophagus, discovered just outside Rome and containing the mummified body of an 8-year-old girl. And you can see the details here. This is particularly adorable. There's a little lion cub in the hunter's pouch as he's whisking her away. Such scenes are variously interpreted. For example, the hunter is often thought to symbolize the triumph of the soul over death, and there are links to Hercules and his lion-skin cape and his successful return from the underworld. But I find it hard, especially in the case of a child's death, not to see the lion cub here being taken by the hunter as representative of the dead child, and the reaction of the lioness, that of the parent or family member left behind. So you can see the lioness's reaction to this event. And so this is a beautiful sort of image on this coffin. And a little bit of a larger view there. The others sort of in their cave-like area over on the right. Let's bring in the leopard himself. The leopard is also paired, in a sense, with the lion in the practice of physiognomy, in which a human being's physical characteristics are likened to those of various animals in an attempt to ascertain an individual's true character or soul through these human-animal similarities. Generally, being lion-like meant evincing a certain masculinity. The strong limbs of a lion, which give him courage, when found in a man, also give the man courage. Leopard-like characteristics, on the other hand, suggest a feminine personality, which one physiognomer describes as, quote, impudent, immoral, spiteful, foolish, a lover of killing and coercion for whoever opposes him, peaceable to whoever makes peace with it, disdainful, haughty, neither tamed nor tamed, unquote. Except in the legs. If a man has leopard-like legs, he is brave and bold. Because like the lion, the limbs of the leopard are strong, leading to this brave personality type. The meaning of particular non-human animal in a metaphor or simile also depends very much on its specific context, outside of which it is very difficult to say whether one is lion-like by virtue of size or strength or courage or leadership skills or some other quality we associate with lionness. So this brings us sort of back into the arena and to a conundrum. The ancient Romans admired the qualities of leopards and lions, described them in scientific treatises, wanted them depicted on their walls and floors and standing in for themselves, possibly on sarcophagi, and wanted to be like them bodily and psychologically, but they also enjoyed watching these felines as well as other admired animals killed in the hundreds and thousands in the arena. Scholars of human-animal relationships in ancient Rome refer to this as the paradox, as my class knows. The love for, the dependence on, the aesthetic appreciation of certain species, certain individual members of certain species, coexisting with the desire to watch many of these same species slaughtered in quantity for entertainment, a paradox that also complicates many of our own contemporary emotional bonds with animals and with other human beings, my own included. performing a kind of psychological and physiological autopsy on the crowds at animal hunts and gladiatorial spectacles, Toril Lindström sheds some light on this paradox by discussing the body's response to hunting, violence, and competition, and the diffusion of responsibility that is a key component of crowd psychology. Especially intriguing in Lindström's study is the connection she makes between the dopamine released when one is excited by competition and aggression and its relationship to sexual arousal, which in part contributes to a deeper understanding of some of the motivation that made it so profitable for prostitutes to hang about outside Roman amphitheaters. It's not just the crowds, it's their arousal and the way arousal affects other bodies also in the crowd. Lindström's study is also especially interesting in terms of the exception to the rule of mass pleasure in the slaughter of both human and non-human animals. In 55 BCE, during games sponsored by the Roman general Pompey the Great, the crowd of spectators in the arena rose up in protest of the slaughter of some elephants. We don't have photographs from that event, but we can look at an elephant for a little bit. Shocked by the sudden death of an elephant who had been hit by a javelin under the eye and died instantly, and delighted by an elephant whose feet had been injured, but who threw its attacker's shields in the air like a juggler, when the elephants charged the bars, separating them from the crowd, and trumpeted their desperate elephant cries, the crowd rose up, cursing Pompey and his cruelty. In unpacking this episode, Lindström describes the significant roles fear and identification played in this sympathy for the elephants. As the elephants charged the barriers, a real issue in pre-Colosseum venues, this could happen, the spectators experienced a fear for their own lives, much like that the elephants themselves seemed to be experiencing, and then the elephants trumpeted, making sounds that are described as human-like in nature, expressing this kind of pure terror. Lindström notes that, as opposed to other spectacles during which the audience did not rise up in protest, during this episode of the elephants, quote, as identifications are often projective, it must be added that these reactions could just as well have been expressions of the spectator's own death anxiety, self-pity, and accusations toward Pompey for having lured them into a dangerous situation, unquote. Since this is a fairly unique occurrence in several centuries worth of slaughter, this notion of identification with the elephants as projections of the audience's own terror and fear for their own safety makes particular sense to me. Identification with a particular species of non-human animal or particular members of a particular species of non-human animal when one is psychologically or physically extremely vulnerable and so open to this potential identification begins to seem like a prerequisite for practicing empathy towards non-human animals generally. However, it is my belief that another creature haunts these spectacles, a creature so dangerous and slippery, so disruptive of emotional bonds between human and non-human animals, indeed between human and human, that its existence until now has remained, if not a carefully guarded secret, then it has been downplayed, disguised, spoken of only in whispers, and that is the concept of the animal itself. For as long as human beings have been attempting to differentiate themselves from non-human animals, for as long as human beings have sought that unique quality in themselves with which to separate themselves from non-human animals, there has existed this creature, the animal, a creature whose enormous power depends sometimes on its ability to transform itself into a recognizable species of non-human animal, sometimes on its ability to remain vague and open and be everything to everyone. And while we can feed it and we can try to tame it and we can use it as a weapon against our enemies, beautiful bears, it is especially dangerous when, as a tool, it is deployed by those who possess the power to back up their use of this rhetorical weapon with real force. If used against yourselves, resist, by all means resist, the animal. Like Virgil's monstrous rumor, covered in feathers under which are multiple eyes, ears, and tongues, which walks on the ground while its head is in the clouds and spreads rumors across North Africa about Dido's affair with that damn foreigner Aeneas, the concept of the animal is so powerful as to deserve some sort of embodiment. So let's embody the animal here. Here you go. For even as the ancient Roman spectators in the arena admired individual species' particular skills or beauty, they also may have viewed the sheer quantity of animals as generically animal, beings rendered less than even lower status Romans in philosophy and law. Lindstrom describes this thusly, quote, "The ruling distinctions between people, animals, freeborn slaves, reinforced by both philosophy and legislation, implied a collectively accepted fact that animals and people could be used as articles for consumption. The availability of animals, gladiators, and criminals was manageable. They saw no end to this availability. To see the rich and influential pay for and then destroy very expensive objects may have been experienced as a luxurious extravagance. For the poor who could never afford a single slave or a donkey, to be spoiled in this way must have been quite satisfying." End quote. Lindstrom also suggests that for Rome's slaves and poor, often badly treated and living in terrible conditions, seeing both animals and human beings tortured and killed may have provided a helpful emotional outlet, the creatures of the arena becoming objects onto which the downtrodden could project fantasies of revenge for their own day-to-day humiliations. So really my main point today, my little piglets, is a super simple one, existing alongside, overlapping with ancient Romans' emotional bonds with favored pets or work animals, with a desire to have one's courage or legs likened to those of a wild feline, was an incredible fear of becoming animal or being animalized by others. Maud Gleason, a classicist at Stanford, has discussed how a horrific ancient disease called elephants was described in animal terms, and how the sufferer of that disease advanced through stages from his or her human state to a hybrid satyr-like state before finally becoming animal. Gleason creates the impression, I don't know the details of this, but that those suffering from the disease were willing to undergo quite horrific treatment in order to slow the progress of the disease, and in part because of their fear of becoming physically animal. And Keith Bradley has very cleverly used the evidence of both Roman laws likening slaves to animals and an ancient novel to argue that slave owners in the ancient world purposely attempted to animalize their slaves in an attempt to control them. The slave could resist verbal attempts to animalize him, refuse to allow the slave owner's rhetoric to affect his sense of self. The slave owner could then redouble his efforts or reinforce the slave's rhetorical or verbal animalization through force or violence, and an ongoing agon of identification. But although this is a really simple point, I don't think we've fully appreciated the potential power contained within this slippery, ever-shifting creature, the animal. Notice, even for this talk, animal has to be chained. He's so slippery. Nor how it interferes with our emotional bonds with both human and non-human animals today. Tyrants and despots have long made use of this creature, and philosophers have long been aware of its existence. In her classic work, Beast and Man, The Roots of Human Nature, Mary Midgley uses the term the beast within to refer to Plato's way of configuring in animal terms those aspects of human behavior we judge evil and prefer to dissociate from ourselves. This treacherous element, she writes, cannot be anything properly human. It must be described in animal terms, and those of no particular animal at that, since all particular animals have their redeeming features. End quote. I actually think that particular animals are also functioning as representatives of this treacherous element, usually animals whom we've generally judged pests with no redeeming features and often happily exterminate. But this openness, this lack of particularity, I think, makes for the most effective rhetorical use of this idea of the beast within, makes for the most effective invective, as I hope to show eminently. Jacques Derrida, too, is quite cross with us about our continued use of the concept of the animal. In his The Animal That Therefore I Am, Derrida writes, quote, "The confusion of all non-living things within the general and common category of the animal is not simply a sin against rigorous thinking, vigilance, lucidity, or empirical authority, it is also a crime." Unquote. Wow, okay. J'accuse, says Derrida. Well, some have accused Derrida of treating words as though they themselves are alive. Silly Derrida. Sticks and stones, Derrida, sticks and stones. You are all educated people, right? You rats, or perhaps I mean vermin, in case any of you have affectionate feelings towards rats and find redeeming features in them. You know that words are not alive, have no effect on the way others treat an individual or on an individual's sense of self, and calling people generic animal-related names has never ever been an initial step in a process that has ended in genocide, right? But even if philosophers, scholars, etc., heed Derrida's warning, so to speak, to avoid this oversimplification, this lumping together of living things, the concept of the animal remains a useful, casually deployed, rhetorical device in the wider world, as we shall see. The notion of the animal could also be a very powerful tool in imperial Rome, especially when flung upon the highly policed elite male body. It could be a very effective tool indeed when used to influence an individual's social identity, affecting one's humanness, one's status as human in the eyes of others. Perhaps even effective after death. So let's return to the topic of cats, wild and domestic, and to the Emperor Nero. Suetonius, perhaps notorious himself for largely inspiring Robert Graves and thus BBC's I, Claudius, writing about 50 years after Nero's death, describes a fascinating episode in the life of the emperor in which Nero is depicted as actively choosing to act like an animal for his own sexual pleasure. Indeed, he prostituted his own chastity to such an extent that when he had defiled nearly every part of his body, he at last came up with a kind of game during which, covered with the hide of a wild beast, he was let loose from a cage and assaulted the groin areas of men and women bound to stakes. After he had raged savagely to his satisfaction, he was finished off by his freedman Doryphorus, a name which means spear bearer, wink, wink, nudge, nudge. For just as Sporus had given himself in marriage to Nero, so did Nero give himself in marriage to Doryphorus. He even imitated the cries and lamentations of a young woman submitting to sex for the very first time. So this is the only instance in all of Suetonius's lives, the first 12 Caesars, in which the princeps is described as dressed and behaving like a non-human animal. And these emperors do like to dress up. They dress up as gods, they dress up in many ways, but this is the only time we see an emperor dressing up as an animal. So where to begin? Let's give Suetonius the benefit of the doubt for the moment and assume this episode really took place. If so, how utterly fascinating, for here we have evidence of an emperor voluntarily transgressing not only the boundaries of acceptable gender expression and sexuality, areas about which elite ancient Romans were already plenty anxious, but also that of species. Here we would have an emperor actively contributing to the undermining of his own social identity as human in the eyes of others, and for what? To play the role of some sort of wild cat, perhaps a leopard even, or a lion, and a twisted imitation of an ad bestias execution in which both wildcat and human being would, in reality, both wind up dead. How strange and undignified for the princeps, the chief citizen of Rome, to want to, however briefly, but ever so accurately. There is the cage, we've got the skin costume, the men and women tied to stakes, the beast fighter to finish him off. How strange and undignified for the emperor to want to use his power to achieve this little death. If this episode, thank you. If this episode really took place, we may also investigate the degree to which Nero self-identified as a particular species of non-human animal. Although an actor performance of some sort and not a permanent state of being, the Emperor Nero was a consummate performer and acting both on stage and off to such an extent that during his reign this line between acting and being is especially blurred in a case of private performance like this one in particular. Suppose Nero really did self-identify as a leopard or a lion. Well, again, this is a wild notion, I think, to the ancient Romans. Many ancient Romans would be, I believe, totally blown away by this notion, as they would be by the commitment of today's humanimals, to borrow the scholar Annie Potts's term, whose degrees of identification as particular species of non-human animal, coincidentally often wild species of cat, vary, but are such as to significantly suffuse these individuals' sense of self. like Catman, who has passed away recently, who has had extensive tattooing, his nose restructured, his upper lip split, silicone implanted in his forehead, cheeks, and lips, teeth replaced with cat dentures, his ears elongated, piercings above his lips for the insertion of nylon whiskers, and has claw-like nails, in order that his body correspond to his sense of self, and who, when asked about his identification, refers to his Huron and Lakota heritage and his ancestors' shape-shifting abilities. Now, compared to Catman, Nero's temporary playing at being some sort of animal can seem a bit lightweight, but without Nero's own subjective account of his experience of identification, we can only speculate. But of course, dear dolphins and cockroaches, we will never know if Nero desired to be some sort of wild animal, however briefly, and I have grave doubts that this episode ever took place. Instead, I think Suetonius is the ingenious Svengali behind this animal act. What the great biographer has done here is taken advantage of the power of the concept of the animal, we should see that one more time, in Roman imperial culture, and by intertwining this concept with other sensitive areas of human bodily behavior in Roman elite cultural life, including acting itself, Suetonius has created an incredibly impressive, darkly humorous piece of invective. While Suetonius refers to all manner of species of non-human animal throughout the lives, including his life of Nero, in this episode he avoids specifying the particular species of wild animal Nero is attempting to play or be here, which I think is significant. He could have said this is a lion skin or a panther skin or something, but he doesn't say it, and I think that's really significant. Now, perhaps he does not know what kind of wild animal skin Nero wears here. He's a historian, sort of, after all. Or perhaps he intentionally avoids saying that this is the skin of a leopard or a lion, lest we associate Nero with the positive qualities that are associated with leopards and lions in ancient Roman culture, and so as to create a generic impression of the emperor's animality. Suetonius presents us with an emperor who seems to seek out an opportunity to express an unspecified but nevertheless wild animality, but continuously undercuts the wild figure Nero is trying to cut. Since, as wild animal, Nero engages in oral sex, viewed as passive and inappropriate for an elite Roman male, and is the passive partner in anal sex with his freedman Doryphorus, a man of lower status with whom, from the honeymoon on, it seems, he may have been accustomed to playing a passive sexual role. Nero may even assume a quadrupedal, animal-like position for his act, of the sort that the men of high-rank Caligula, like to confine to cages, had to assume simply to occupy the space of the cage itself, according to Suetonius. In a later episode at the end of Nero's life, Suetonius explicitly describes Nero as assuming a quadrupedal position when, having fled Rome and been declared an enemy of the state, his wild hide replaced with a thorn-pierced cloak, he crawls on all fours through a ditch like an animal to enter secretly the villa of a freedman, a place of temporary safety. This brief second allusion to Nero's reduced animal-like state pairs beautifully with his earlier animal act. The Nero who once played predator becomes prey. The Nero who Suetonius portrays as playing animal by choice is later rendered animal by necessity. And Suetonius has transferred a process, that of animalization, that is usually reserved for the lowest members of Roman society, namely slaves, to that of the very highest member of Roman society. But to what effect? For unlike a living slave, whose rhetorical animalization can be reinforced by force, and on whom the projection of an identity of animal may wear away at his or her sense of oneself as human, Nero is long dead when Suetonius animalizes him. One's social identity, however, say modern sociologists, can continue to metamorphose even after death. Take sainthood, for example. And Nero really is a slippery bugger. Though according to Suetonius, a pretty terrible guy, he was also beloved by many, and even after death, his statues were decorated, flowers were left on his grave, and in Suetonius's own lifetime, someone came forward claiming to be Nero and gained not insignificant political support for his claim. So by actively trying to influence how Nero is remembered, also a big subject in Roman culture, rhetorically animalizing him and thus calling into question his very status as human, Suetonius strikes a tiny blow against the springing up of future Neros, a potentiality, I believe, built into the power of the position of princeps itself. And Suetonius's invective would not be effective were it not for the great anxiety surrounding this concept in Roman imperial culture generally. This concept that may have allowed the audience in the arena to project those revenge fantasies on living animals, which were seen as of lower status simply by virtue of being non-human, whose individual beauty and skills could also be admired, envied, desired, and loved. This concept of the animal and the use of particular animals with which we have perhaps a less than passionate emotional bond to stand in for the concept of the animal is, of course, my dear little lambs still very much with us today, wreaking havoc on human and non-human animals alike. Humans' emotional bonds with their animals and our bonds with one another as well. Strangely reminiscent of Nero's quadrupedal flight through a ditch when Muammar Gaddafi was killed in October of 2011, several newspapers ran headlines comparing Gaddafi to a rat. Reuters, for example, wrote, quote, "Gaddafi caught like a rat in a drain, humiliated and shot," unquote. Earlier in August 2011, the Daily Mail reported that Gaddafi was hiding like a rat, and shortly before that, the newspaper The Australian reported that, quote, "Muammar Gaddafi's rat cunning holds sway," unquote. So what's with all these bloody rats? It turns out that Gaddafi himself referred to the opposition fighters in Libya as rats as a way of animalizing and thus dehumanizing his enemies. So when he was killed, these newspapers found in the rat both a vivid way of describing his manner of death and turned the tables on him rhetorically, animalizing him via the same species he used to animalize his own enemies. So, in conclusion, kittens, I am going to commit a crime, according to Derrida, that is, and the work of cognitive scientists is confirming that we are right to be wary of the potential power of seemingly harmless or merely descriptive metaphors, whether those utilizing specific species of non-human animal or the generic concept of the animal itself. It seems our brains have a tendency to confuse reality and literalness with metaphor and symbol. Robert Sapolsky of Stanford, writing in the New York Times, notes that, quote, "Part of the emotional contagion of the genocide of the Tutsis in Rwanda arose from the fact that when militant Hutu propagandists called for the eradication of the Tutsi, they iconically referred to them as cockroaches. Get someone to mention where his insula activates at the mention of an entire people, and he's primed to join the bloodletting," unquote. So we think metaphors, we get them, but our brains may be responding to them differently and more crudely, in a sense. So some of us may think that words, rhetoric, metaphors have no power to do harm in the real world, but our own brains beg to differ. So in a lighter spirit, but then again, who knows what the outcome may be, I am here today simply to tell you that the Emperor Nero was no leopard, no lion, but instead was a passive pussycat, a species, incidentally, for whom the ancient Romans did not have a great deal of affection. Nero, indeed, was merely an animal. Thank you.
I hope there'll be great comments and questions because we have a few minutes for that as well.
Okay.
Connie?
Yeah. So I actually have a couple of different questions. One was very specific, and it has to do, obviously, with the horse early on, who seems to be a sort of transitional figure between the human and the, was it the leopard then that was eating, biting both the human and the horse. And I was wondering, sort of between domestic and wild, between human and I don't know if that or whether that plays out. So that was one. I'll just stop there. I have another question potentially. But.
Yeah, I'm not quite sure that I can answer that question, but we see something that we've been discussing quite a bit in class in the ancient Roman text. I mean, it's really, there's only one other instance that I know of where we have a description of a human who wants to really kind of enact this animality, and in that case it's a prostitute that's dressing as a leopard so that a senator can hunt her. So I mean, these contexts are really specific, but it seems that the desire is for the non-domestic, and then I'm kind of fascinated by that, because in terms of emotional bond, we want to be those animals we actually don't live the closest to. So in trying to sort of get away from this binary, which is really what interests me, right? I'm making a fuss of it, but I really want to escape this. I think that the idea of the other is still this, it's a desired sort of quality. And the horse is interesting. Certainly, horses throughout ancient literature get some really great moments. The talking horses of Achilles, the untamable horse of Alexander. There's a horse that Caesar has in Suetonius that has feet that are like a human. So there's a kind of bringing the horse toward us, I guess. That doesn't answer your question,
well,
but...
Can I ask them a second? Because what your answer is making me think of this, what might otherwise be seen as triangular desire of the wild animal as the rival and the object of identity. So you want what the animal wants, but you want to be the animal. In order to be the animal, you have to kill the animal. I don't know if that, that seems to be another way of uncovering this sort of sexual unconscious that seems to be. No, that's great. I don't know so much about triangular identification. I'm very... It seems, it sort of seems to be what you were already describing very nicely.
That's interesting. I think it's maybe a personal problem, my discomfort with that other piece, the being and the killing being a prerequisite for the... and that somehow it just comes back to dominance, and that's something else I'm wanting to get away. Is it really as simple as that? And maybe it is, and again, it may be deeply built into us. No, that's great. Thank you for the term. Triangular identification.
Or triangular desire.
Triangular desire. Yeah, we could talk. Thank you. I need to learn more. Excellent. Thanks. John?
Thanks, Steve, and thank you very much, Sue. That was a terrific paper. I have a specific narrow classicist type question for you in just a moment, but before I launch that one, I wanted to pick up on what Kari was asking about in the first part of her question, thinking a bit more about the role of the horse in that sarcophagus relief, or horses, really. And what strikes me as potentially of interest is that we have several horses, or at least two in the parts you've shown. One, in both cases, they are paired with their human riders or their human partners. Here's the first one, in which it's the human and animal horse who are working in tandem to steal the wild cub. And they are working as a pair together, so you get two types of animal relations just in that iconic image. And likewise, in the other scene with the leopard or whatever it is, there we go, killing, it seems, both the animal, the horse, and the human simultaneously. It's as if they're paired, the domesticated horse with the human, in contrast to the wild in two different ways. They're trying to domesticate the cub, it seems, taking it away, stealing it, and they themselves are being savaged in the wild. These, as you know, these sarcophagus reliefs are often packed with these deep oppositions and polarities that sometimes might be also there as well. I mean, bringing those two types of animals together.
Thank you, yeah.
So that's just a thought in the way we hope today will go, prompting more questions than answers. My question was a specific one about your Nero passage, and I think I agree with your final assessment that it's more likely to be a nice bit of character blackening than a piece of history. But I'm particularly interested in the pairing with the marriage with Sporus in that one passage. And that's a famous episode, as you know well, in Nero's life also, in which he went not just through the process of gender reversal in marrying a male as a bride, and there's a parallel, I think, between the animal-human reversal and the gender reversals. At least Suetonius is putting them together there. But the question I have for you is the fact that the way Suetonius depicts them, both of these are neither they're not simple gender transgressions or animal-human transgressions done in private or for purely personal sexual pleasure. They're ritual enactments of major social, cultural events, namely a beast hunt or a public wedding, so that I'm curious about that cultural aspect of it, the social aspects of the particular context in which he chooses to transgress, if you like, or at least that Suetonius makes him transgress, maybe to speak more accurately. Is there something significant in that as well? That it's as you quite rightly pointed, it's a detailed description of a beast hunt, that it's not just any kind of animalization of Nero.
Yeah, okay. Well, I mean, of course, that cultural component is highly significant, and I focus on Nero's bodily behavior, and I'm really interested in embodiment and bodily behavior here. Somebody else has done a much better job of this than I, sort of discussing the degree to which the emperor's body stands in for the state of the whole empire, and actually suggesting that Suetonius is sort of living, animated descriptions of bodily behavior of the emperors is competing in Rome at large with sort of idealized sculptural depictions of the emperor. So I do think that, I mean, this is an old notion, the body politic, et cetera. I think that there's a lot going on with the bodies of the emperors, so that in transitioning between a kind of private reenactment of a public event, the threat is even greater, because here Nero is he's not merely indulging a personal taste. What he does is writ large on the rest of the empire, and his personal behavior, he's going to make Rome this crazy sort of metamorphosizing, gender-bending like place, and we should be careful about this. So I think yeah, certainly the fact that, again, from the point of view of invective, which in ancient rhetoric there aren't really clear rules about, it's sort of anything can go, even making something up to get at the truth a little bit more. By setting these scenes or describing Nero as doing these sort of things that are travesty of important Roman social institutions, absolutely, it's just enlarging, I think, that the threat that Nero is, or the threat that, again, I think is inherent in the position of princeps. So where I ultimately kind of go with this, more philologically speaking, is to Derrida again on the beast and the sovereign, and the idea of a space in society that is outside, and how the emperors have no peers until much later, right? They're on their own. They have nothing to really sort of measure themselves against, and they're actually not human. And we've got emperors who are deified in Suetonius, and then we've got emperors who are sort of monstrified or something in Suetonius. And I don't think the emperor is actually ever human, and that sort of interests me, I think. But I get at it through Derrida and the sovereignty and beast sort of work that he's done, this place outside.
Thank you.
I believe you had a question, and then Bill.
I'm Allison. I was wondering if you, and this might not be a question that your research makes you able to answer, but the disease you mentioned, elephants, I was wondering if you knew of any like modern analog of that, or how maybe you would imagine it would be different in our kind of like medicalized psychiatric community that most of us live in now versus how that was experienced in the ancient world versus maybe like a more modern like tribal community. That's just it's an interesting idea to me.
It's a great question. I can't answer that question, but maybe somebody here who knows more. Chris?
Well, there is this like tropical worm or something that causes something called elephantitis, where you can get this like inflammation. There's a movie called The Elephant Man about this guy who was disfigured by it, and he didn't want to go out in public. And I don't know if like it's the same etymology.
You know, it is. There is a relationship, and I can actually point you to Professor Gleason's work on this as well. My answer is cynical and based on nothing at all, like no real knowledge of the subject. But I think I wouldn't be surprised if there are diseases that are described in these terms today, because it's so useful to describe things this way, and people do think sometimes that it's only descriptive, but it's not only descriptive. And also because now we have something, species identity disorder, this notion of not feeling that you are, that you are the species that you are, and the idea that we are, having gotten past some other kind of barriers about gender and sexuality and so forth, that we still think wanting to be a different species is a medical disorder that might need treatment, etc., makes me think this is where a lot of lefties hit up against their sort of barrier. And same with Catman. He really freaks people out when you first see him. And if you think you're a very open-minded and loving and understanding individual, I think he poses a real challenge. And I feel like at first, I've seen it a lot now, but at first I've talked about this in class, a kind of bodily, revolted response, which is not at all going along with how I think about him and how I judge him. I don't judge him. But the fact that we have something called species identity disorder now, and it's being treated as something that needs treatment, makes me sort of cynical about the use of animalization in medical and other in the description of other contemporary diseases. But that is based on having no knowledge of medicine.
It's an interesting idea to think about in terms of cross-cultural psychology, but then it's also really interesting to think about how things were different in the ancient world and how, a story like the one you brought up had a different political meaning that probably would never exist in our world today. Anyway.
Bill. Did you have a question?
Okay, yeah. Well, I have a quick question. Sorry for coming late, but I loved what I heard.
Thank you.
I'm wondering if Romans had a classification of species that's well known and understood. I don't know the answer to that question, but if that's the case, would that provide any kind of a rubric within which you could try to explore these questions?
Certainly, let's say the Greco-Romans did. There's a lot of work on that on the Greek side of things, and the Romans take over that. There's a scholar in Rome, in Italy, at a university in Italy, who's looking carefully at that in terms of gender, actually, and looking at the way gender plays a role in this organization of animal life. So yeah, there is more that can be done with what we know of the ancient classification system in terms of kind of unpicking these broader questions, certainly. It's a highly gendered, like physiognomy, it's a highly gendered sort of system. Yeah, so they did. I'm not quite sure where I go with that, but I'm glad you brought that up. Thank you. Yeah.
Eduardo?
That was a really great talk. I loved it. And I want to ask you a question. I mean, you're obviously moving away from this idea of animal as metaphor, right? Sort of a literary studies of this is not a real animal, because these are things that are happening to real animals with real people, and there's a becoming of an animal, these sorts of things. So I very much, and there's certainly some sort of profound psychodynamic process in which desire and killing and power all wrapped up. Very much appreciate that, and I can see how, but also, and then I see how you're sort of playing with this tension with these animals who are also as the animal. These are also sort of become very general figures partially because of the kinds of animals you're dealing and they're dealing with. These are top predators that are brought in, pulled out of their ecologies and things like that. So I was just wondering if you might be able to reflect on as you've come across sources on just more everyday kind of animal things you come up with. Oh, I don't know, poultry or
Fish.
vermin, fish, you know, things that are commensal type things, I don't know, deer, these sorts of boars, whatever. I mean, what kind of other stories are there that somehow are more about interactions that tell us something else about what's happening here, that aren't about always these, you know, sovereigns and the animals that would likely represent them, which are top predators, that are somehow as you say, pulled out of relation, right? These are leopards and lions that are not, you know, just like the sovereign is sort of outside of is the exception in some ways. This is also, these are exceptional. So how does that contrast to some other things that may, you know, make their ways into the archives and images and things like that?
Okay, well, I'm not sure I'll be able to say anything about that, really. Certainly we have tons of visual evidence and textual allusions and so forth to the sort of the animals that would have been in Italy, domestic animals, etc. And we have images where people are cherishing their sort of the animals that they live close to, and we have images of animals being led to sacrifice and things like that. Domestic, you know, common animals, let's say. I think one of the problems we have, I think this is perhaps all I can say, I'm afraid on this, is that one of the problems we have all this literature and all of these images, but most of our evidence for any kind of sort of deeper relationship or even like a relationship, most of our evidence is about elites in the ancient world. And so the people, this is just John Berger again, really, the people who are living possibly more intimately, who are bringing that baby cow into the farmhouse so that it doesn't die from the cold and helps keep them warm as well. We just don't have any of their voices. We only have their representations, these kind of representations on which so much can be, you know, writ. So certainly the Romans kept pets, and they had cats that were mostly work cats meant to get rid of vermin, and we've got lovely images of the cherishing of a particular species of dog. We know they hunted all sorts of things, sort of boar, etc. I don't know a lot about poultry, but there are things to know about birds, certainly. Collection. We have a lot of facts, but not a lot that goes beyond the fact, I would say. And I've been thinking our class had to read Berger at the very beginning, and just a lot about how big a missing piece that is. So, and it's becoming bigger because of increasingly cosmopolitanized world, really. My parents brought, we had sheep being raised in the house for certain periods of time so they wouldn't freeze to death in the barn, and it's, yeah. And I imagine things went on like that, but we yeah, sorry.
Did you name your sheep?
Oh yeah, yeah. And we ate a cow, Scotty. Yeah.
But as one knows, there's a linguist at Columbia, Paul Koppelman, has written quite a bit about mind concepts of poultry.
Yeah,
and it takes
okay.
us into very interesting contours. But why don't we applaud you?
Thank you.